Thank you, Deputy Speaker. This bill comes to us in a context of widespread concerns about the capability and independence of our public service, whether they are still willing and able to provide the frank and fearless advice on which our system of government depends. There are untold recent revelations and scandals, such as unearthed under the Robo-Debt Royal Commission, where independence was clearly lacking. And what was the human cost of that consequence of that lack of independence? A failed illegal policy was implemented which ultimately drove some Australians to take their own lives, and untold misery in other people's lives. It was utterly unconscionable and must never happen again. And so to prevent it happening again, we need deep reform in our public sector. But my worry is that this bill is not delivering the deep reform that we need. It is delivering a series of tweaks, each one sensible and worthy of our support, but falls well short of what the Australian people were promised and what they reasonably expected from this government. It is not enough for this government to do slightly better, to have slightly more integrity than their predecessor. The government has spoken extensively of the robo-debt scandal in this House, in the papers, across the political divide. But frankly, when it comes to implementing changes that will make significant difference, it is falling well short. We need complete transformation. The APS must be built and rebuilt around the principles of integrity and service. We are a long way from there, and there is a lot of work that is needed to get there. And frankly, this bill just doesn't take us far enough towards these goals. It barely moves us in that direction at all. To provide some context, as members would be aware, the 30 Review in 2019 lay out a reform vision for the Australian public service. In the past year, the Minister has put in a fair amount of work in consultation and engagement to test and develop some of 30's recommendations. And today, some 3.5 years after the report was finalised, we have the first piece of legislation resulting from that report. Unfortunately, what we don't have is a comprehensive response to the review, either from the government or from the government of the day or from the new government. Right now, we don't have a clear idea about which recommendations are supported by the government and which are opposed. We don't have a roadmap for implementation of recommendations beyond what is contained in this bill, and we don't have certainty about where the APS will be in 2, 5 or 10 years' time. In fact, all we really have is a high-level speech from the Minister in October last year, where she set out a reform agenda with 4 components: integrity, client-centred service, an APS as a model employer, and capability. These principles and components are all fine in principle, but a vision isn't enough. We need details about how and when the government is going to achieve this vision, what the priorities and trade-offs are, and we need to know how this bill fits into the bigger picture. Without those details, it's hard to know whether this government is serious about APS reform, because this bill, frankly, doesn't go very far. It creates a new APS value, mandates the creation of a purpose statement, and changes some sensible but minor governance changes. It is certainly not a reform bill. For a government that spent many years in opposition, waging a campaign against the diminishment of the public service, and has had a year in office to develop its agenda, I honestly expected more, and so did the people of Wentworth. I expected a bold and ambitious piece of reform that would start to rebuild the APS capability and restore trust and faith in this vital national institution. My amendments, which I now move, will not be agreed to in this place. The government has made it clear. My intention was not that they would become law, but rather that they would shine a light on what we ought to see from this bill. First, they would require the government to provide a formal written response to the 30 Review, so we know what they intend to implement and when. Second, they would require the government to adopt all of 30's themes as an APS value instead of simply stewardship. The others include integrity, merit and openness, absolutely critical values for the Australian public service. Third, they would expand the new rules around the APS census to apply to the parliamentary departments as well as the public service departments. There is no obvious reason to me why an employee of the Department of Foreign Affairs, for instance, should enjoy more transparency over their agency's morale and performance, for example, than the Department of Parliamentary Services. And finally, they would require the government to table a statement whenever it appoints an agency head, outlining the recruitment process. These are the most senior appointments that the government makes to the services. This would not prevent any captain's picks from being made, but at least it would make it transparent that when a position was not advertised or if no other candidates were considered. This statement would be disallowable, meaning that this chamber or the other place could potentially veto the appointment of an agency head. This would be a new power for the parliament, and I think one that would be rarely, if ever, used. But the potential exercise of the power would change the incentives of the government making these appointments. I believe it will also change the incentives of senior public servants, discouraging them to become too aligned with one party or another. Now, for some people, they may think that this is, the stuff of Parliament, the stuff of the Canberra bubble, that people, back in our constituencies don't care about this. And that is frankly wrong. It was just last week I was talking to John, a key businessman in my constituency, and he was telling me about his deep disappointment of the politicisation of these important public appointments. He comes from business, and his desire for government is that they have the best people for the job, not the friends of the people in power. And again, what I'm putting forward here today would increase the transparency and accountability of our public services. And I think, from what the government actually campaigned on, these are values that the government said they care about. But when it comes to it, when amendments are presented to them, they're not willing to support this. Each of these amendments would strengthen our public sector and also demonstrate that this bill could be far more than what it is. I will be supporting this bill, but I will also be urging, supporting and in the Minister to go further and to live up to the commitments the government has made with respect to the Australian Public Service and to integrity more generally. Thank you.
I thank